Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to be able to introduce Dr. Mark Cole to you. Since everyone here is an educator, has an appreciation for learning and history, you will appreciate his professional journey. Today he is an associate lecturer in the history department at Cleveland State University. He received his doctorate in modern European history from the University of Florida, his master's in European history from the University of Akron, and his bachelor's in German from the University of Toledo. He specializes in modern Europe and Germany, specifically the history of Nazism and the Holocaust. He is author of his most recent publication is a book chapter, and if you'll pardon my German, Fortschritt der Schulenwirtschaft, Food and Industrial Discipline in Nazi Germany. Dr. Cole has presented his research across the United States, in Germany, and in Israel. He's been a fellow of the Leo Baeck Institute in Jerusalem, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and the Holocaust Educational Foundation at Northwest University. Now, with that, I would like to give a warm welcome to Dr. Mark Cole.
I'm really loud, so do you think I need the microphone if I talk like this? No. No? Okay, good. Just put it down there. Okay. So thank you everybody for coming this afternoon, evening. Thank you, Esther, for inviting me. I wish I could bottle her energy and keep it with me all the time and take little sips of it. When Esther approached me, I guess it was over the summer, was it not, about being here today, she told me about this seminar, this workshop, and what the topic and nature of it is. And as soon as she did, an image sort of sprung forth right into my mind's eye of a teenage Holocaust victim. I could hardly fault you right now if, in your mind's eye, you're thinking about a particular teenager, Holocaust victim, perhaps a Dutch girl, one who died in early 1945 in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in Germany at the tender age of 15. Who am I talking about? Anne Frank. So this might be the image that you have in your mind. But today I want to focus on another life. The face in my mind's eye back on that summer day was a boy who was also 15 years old, but not when he died. He was 15, actually he turned 15 just a couple months before Germany invaded his native Poland. And his name is David Hershkovitz. Now, I'm guessing most of you have not heard of David Hershkovitz. Part of, you may think I get royalties from the sale of this book, but I swear to you I do not. But one of the things that I want to do today is I want to suggest that this is a very, very useful resource for us to understand the Holocaust. David lived in the city of Łódź. In Yiddish, it's Lutz. What the Germans would later call Litzmannstadt, that is Litzmann's city. It was a city named after a German general who, back in World War I, when they invaded Poland in 1914, this Litzmann was the general who took the city of Łódź, and so in his honor, they named the city after him. I think we can go one more. So I wanted to have a map here so we can orient ourselves. This is the classroom me. And so Łódź is right here in what we would consider Western Poland. Now, Łódź is an interesting place because the Łódź of 1939 when the Germans invade is not the same Łódź that it was 100 years before. In fact, if we go back to 1820, Łódź is a veritable, what I would call, backwater. It's got a whopping 767 people living in it. Roughly 250 of them are Jews. It's about 70 miles or so southwest. You can see here's Warsaw, the capital in the center, It's about 70 miles away. But Łódź is going to change very, very quickly. Within 100 years, so by 1920, Łódź will have 670,000. Is that back? Whatever. It will have 670,000 people. So from a little more than 700 to 670,000 in 100 years, in a century. Quite amazing growth. Of that 670,000, roughly 230,000 of them were Jews, making Łódź the second largest Jewish community in Poland. And of course, Poland, as Esther reminded us, has the second largest concentration of Jews in the world in the early 20th century. The population surge in Łódź is driven largely, to make a long story short, largely by industrialization. So if we look at Łódź here very quickly, when the Germans are going to invade it, one of the reasons it gets kind of a special status, a new status, is because of where it's located. This yellow line is the Polish boundary in 1939. You'll notice that Łódź is right here in the sort of lighter sectioned area. It's in a part of Germany, or a part of Poland that becomes Germany. It's actually physically annexed into Germany proper. The Germans called it the Warthegau. For us, it doesn't mean much. It just means it becomes part of the German Reich, of the Third Reich. The darker part isn't incorporated. It's administered as a sort of colony. And so this is kind of interesting because it's going to shape the way that Łódź will be dealt with and treated in the late 1930s and 1940s. The industrialization, so maybe we could go one more slide. The industrialization of Łódź, which is going to lead to this precipitous growth in the population, is driven largely by the textile industry, that is making clothes. And Łódź is famously called, oftentimes it is called the Manchester of Poland, Manchester, England, where industrialization was so important. Although I suppose Poles think of Manchester as the Łódź of England, I would have to imagine. Waves of Polish peasants, when industrialization began to occur, waves of Polish peasants left the countryside looking for better opportunities in the city. Many of them Jews, many coming from the Russian territories that Esther talked about, Russian Poland, the Pale of settlement. Most of them were poor, most of them were Hasidic, that is, a variety of Orthodox. There was a second wave of Jews who came into this area, largely from Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, also Orthodox but not Hasidic, and therefore the Jewish population in Łódź was anything but monolithic. It was quite varied and different. By the time the Germans invaded in 1939, the population had swelled to probably something like 250,000 Jews in the city of Łódź. Today, that is in the 21st century, in 2017, the population of Łódź is about 1 million. But perhaps only 300 or so of those are Jews. How this is possible, of course, is the story, or more accurately, the nightmare of the Holocaust. One of the ways in which we as teachers, I believe, that we can truly impact our students in the classroom is to do exactly what Esther said, right, as sort of almost an afterthought. That is to offer them a personal connection to the tragic events of the past. It's one thing to give our students numbers. 6 million Jews are killed during the Holocaust. 1 to 1.5 million of them are children. Numbers so large that I see in my own students, I think they remain kind of unfathomable. It's kind of hard to get a handle on numbers that big. But it's quite another thing, I think, to have them become intimately familiar with the details of just one life. And that's why I'm focusing on the story of David Syrakowiak today. What I might suggest is, after the students learn the details of one life, then ask them to multiply those horrid details by 6 million. The cold, unrelatable numbers are transformed by this truly ghastly calculus into human beings who, just like our students, once had hopes, dreams, memories, fears, and futures. Such was certainly the case with David Sirakowiak. His story comes to us rather miraculously, like Anne Frank's diary, by his own words, his diary, which covers the period from the 28th of June, 1939 to April 15th of 1943. It was found, Sam, can we go one more? So this is one of the more popular versions of the text. It was found, his diary that is, was found by a Polish Gentile in an apartment in Łódź, in an apartment where this man had been forced to evacuate 5 years earlier when the Nazis established the closed ghetto that is Łódź. And surprisingly, he found a bunch of notebooks sitting on a wood-burning stove and a whole bunch of notes. There are probably 7 notebooks. We have 5 of them. Those other 2 are probably in the ashes of that stove. That is where those other 5 notebooks were destined to be. That is kindling. If the Russians had not liberated the city in January of 1945 during a severely cold winter. So imagine that. The story of this boy literally being dropped into the fire as bombs are falling on the heads of Poles and Jewish prisoners in 1945. For mostly political reasons, especially a surge in Polish anti-Semitism by the communist government in Poland in the late 1960s, the notebooks in this form that I have up here, the 5 notebooks together, weren't published until the 1960s. When we read the words of David Sirakowiak, one cannot help but compare him to the much more famous diarist, Anne Frank. There are indeed similarities, but I would argue important and vast differences too. Both have sisters. They live in middle-class households. Both have stable, if not unproblematic, relationships with their parents. If you've read the Diary of Anne Frank, you know her and her mom are a bit abrasive towards one another at certain times, and as we'll talk about a little bit later, David and his father share that relationship as well. Both diarists are inquisitive, clever, immensely talented, and what makes their stories all the more tragic is the question of what could have been, that is, had they survived. Both were destined to great things, each in their own way, had they not been murdered by the Nazis. But we must also remember the limits of comparison. Each diary is useful, I would argue, in a classroom, but each in its own way as well. The diary of David Sirakowiak offers much insight that we cannot glean from the diary of Anne Frank. The latter writes from the shelter of an attic in Amsterdam that, until discovered in August of 1944, keeps her shielded from what Lawrence Langer has called, quote, the landscape of a savage and incessant oppression and the diminishing existence that came with it. What Anne Frank experienced after leaving the annex, as her hiding spot was called, though certainly terrible, we cannot get any details about it because she no longer had the ability to document it. David's diary records, in agonizing detail, the slow, torturous demise of an individual and a family in the context of a ghetto. And this is what is so different about it. The diary gives us near daily observations from a keen-eyed youth as they happened, and powerfully draws readers into the tormented life of a ghetto prisoner. Already in December of 1939, just a few months after invasion, the Germans were hatching plans for the Łódź ghetto, marking out a 1.5 square mile area, part of the city, centered around the slum-like Bałuty neighborhood. So those smokestacks that I showed you, that typically Jewish part of that area, this was what we'll call the slum of Łódź. It was barely electrified. It had very little plumbing. And lots of what I might deem hovels for the working class, the very poor working class. And of course, it was no coincidence that they chose the worst part of the city to overcram Polish Jews into. By the 1st of May 1940, those Jews who had not successfully fled the city were brutally pushed into the ghetto, and it was sealed off. So a ghetto is a hermetically, I use the term hermetically sealed, very, very difficult to get in and out, and especially since it was in the Warthegau, it was in that annexed portion, it's in a different region. It was very, very hard for prisoners to get through the sewers or the walls, and so it very much was a hermetically sealed ghetto. The ghetto administration was headed by a man by the name of Hans Bibov, and I've got a picture of him up here. Bibov was a 38-year-old businessman who joins the party late. He's not an old believer. He saw the economic potential of Łódź, namely via ghetto factories and plundering the inhabitants. So that is, he personally enriched himself and the Third Reich, perhaps to the tune of 50 million Reichsmarks by the end of 1945. His man on the ground is seen next to him standing here, Chaim Rumkowski, one of the more, I will say, problematic, perhaps, figures in the history of the Holocaust. Chaim Rumkowski was the head, the Jewish head, the head of the Judenrat, or Jewish Council. His official title was the Elder of the Jews, the Älteste. And it would be Bibov who would give the orders, and it would unfortunately be the Jewish Council and Chaim Rumkowski as head of the Jewish Council to carry out those orders, to figure out how those orders could and should be carried out. And he did this, of course, with the help of the ghetto police. David's diary is silent about these early events, and scholars believe that they are likely part of those lost two notebooks. Our first glimpse into David's life is in the summer of 1939, while he is away at a Jewish summer camp in the picturesque Tatras Mountains in southern Poland. The threat of war is in the air, but it doesn't dominate his life. Upon returning, he notes in July 1939 in his diary, we arrive at 6 o'clock in the morning. I take the luggage, and under fire from a terrible downpour, it's raining hard, I go to a streetcar with my heavy bag. On the way, I meet Mom. God, what a joy. At home, the same with father and sister. I eat, go to bed, and sleep almost all day. Sounds like a typical teen, right? Once the war begins, we start to see what a lively, funny, quick-witted, yet sober, young person he was, even as the bombs fell. In September 1939, he noted, an alarm at 12:30 at night. I curse as much as I can. In the street, it's cold, dark, and nasty. In the shelter, we want to amuse ourselves a little. But as usual, the females raise an uproar, shrieking, it's no joke, this is war. We leave for the street, excuse me. Bombs and cold are better than old women. This should always be kept in mind. This is that humor and wit that he has. And then he gets serious. Long live humor, down with hysteria. This is this kind of sober, very methodical, deep thinker that we start to see emerging. As the diary continues, David, his younger sister Nadia, and their parents, Maslek and Shura Shirakowiak, have been forced into a tiny apartment in the ghetto, and their struggle for existence truly begins. David's parents won't let him go to school initially. They're afraid two things will happen. He will either be murdered outright by the Germans, the occupying Germans, or they will seize him and use him for forced labor. And they're scared to death, so they're not going to let him go to school. This is one of the things that I would say probably kills David Shirakowiak. As I'll talk about, increasingly talk about, education is a really important part of his life, and learning is a very important part of his life. This is just a temporary sort of holdback from school, but this is how he answers it in September of 1939. Damn the times when I complained about getting up in the morning and about tests. If only I could have them back. not so typical teen there. I guess he could be typical or not so typical. When I mentioned his potential earlier, I was referring to just how absolutely brilliant. But I remember when I was 16, and comparatively speaking, I was a blathering idiot compared to David Hershkovitz. He speaks or studies Latin, Hebrew, French, German, English, and Yiddish. So I don't know what you slackers have been doing your whole life. And of course, his mother tongue is Polish. Throughout his entire ordeal, one of the things that he uses to make ends meet, to get extra rations, to get extra money, is to actually tutor in these languages. Many people think that learning English in particular is going to be particularly important if they can ever get out of this disaster. And so he ends up tutoring students. He's at the top of his class, earning honors continually, all the while being in this context of the ghetto when he actually does go back to school. And one of the things that's very clear is he feels sorry for himself, but he never loses this desire to learn, to get educated, to better himself. That is, this is one of the things that drives him, and I would say it's one of the things that probably makes him last so long. He has a keen sense of history. When the yellow star is introduced, he laments the return, quote, of the Middle Ages, what Esther referenced. Back in probably a reference to, I'm assuming, the 13th century, the Fourth Lateran Council, when Pope Innocent decreed that Jews would wear badges or funny-looking hats. He is astonishingly, and this is the part that I think is most interesting, he's astonishingly aware of international and European politics. And as a Marxist, socialist in particular, he believes in a cooperative utopian future for all of humanity. To give some sense of his goals and the caliber of his thinking, now this is great, he hoped one day, get a load of this, so he writes early in his diary, he hoped one day to write a treatise called The Semite. So he's thinking this in 1939. And he talks about how this has been a plan for a long time, you know, like he's an old fellow and he's been planning this for decades and decades and decades. He's saying, you know, I've been working on this for a long time and I just recently went back to it. But I've got this idea, this treatise that I'm working on called The Semite. He says it would lay the groundwork for a peaceful coexistence with Arabs and Eretz Israel. So think about that. He in 1939, in the 1930s, is already thinking about important political matters. Although he is, and this is even more interesting, I would say, that although he is politically and ideologically strong-willed and not pious, he somehow remains culturally sensitive. And this is one of these interesting things. As synagogues close in Łódź, he wrote, quote, "Every year I have considered the avoidance of prayer liberation. I now experience every order pertaining to Jews with great pain because I know what faith brings to its believers. To take away from a man his only consolation, his faith, to forbid his beloved, life-affirming religion is the most horrendous crime. Jews won't let Hitler get away with it. Our revenge will be terrible." Indeed, one of the things that we get from the diaries is, and one of the things many of my students find interesting, is that David is very quick to lay blame and criticize people he thinks who are in the wrong, who he thinks or he sees fit need to be criticized, especially Chaim Rumkowski, who at one point he calls a, quote, sadist moron. He also takes jabs at the brutality of the Jewish police, the Jewish ghetto police. He also is very, very critical of what he terms the Prominenten in German. That is, those wealthy Jews who use their power and influence to avoid what might be perhaps a central theme of the nearly 400 pages of text that we have. And that central theme, I might argue, is hunger. That is, food is, in many of the works of survivors and of those diary accounts we have, is food and hunger at the core. He was often tutoring. You might be wondering who had money to pay for a tutor, and of course it was the privileged children. And he tutored privileged children. And in one of the points he excoriates the family, who he says, quote, eats better in the ghetto than his family did before the war. And then in an interesting turn of phrase, he says, quote, "I wish I could burn up that whole gang," he wrote in an infuriating manner. One of the things that makes the diary so powerful is readers are forced to come to terms with, in excruciating detail, the system of torment, humiliation, and starvation that was intentionally created by the Nazis, that ultimately destroyed 250,000 Jewish lives in the Łódź ghetto. This is what is absent, I would say, from the Anne Frank diary, right? This level of detail. Two different works doing two different things. If we look at a couple of examples, in May of 1942, he writes, "There are no vegetables in the June ration, not even potatoes. Now Rumkowski won't have to bother himself that people have eaten their potatoes too early. We won't even have a chance to see them this time. The situation is worsening, and there is no hope for an end. They keep relocating Jews from small neighboring towns into the ghetto, while the deportations from the ghetto have stopped. Even that chance for getting out of the ghetto has been taken away. Death is striking left and right. A person becomes thin, an hourglass, and pale in the face. Then comes the swelling. A few days in bed or in the hospital, and that's it. The person was living, the person is dead. We live and die like cattle." On April 15th of that year, "I am completely sick. I have a high fever. I bought a bear medication for the flu, fever, and cold for Nadia, his sister, and me. Nadia stays in bed, and I think she will remain there for another day or two. Mrs. Deutsch came to see me today. I think she is the most devoted friend I have in the ghetto, or anywhere else for that matter. In the evening, I had to prepare food and cook supper, which exhausted me totally. In politics, there's absolutely nothing new. Again, out of impatience, I feel myself beginning to fall into melancholy. There is really no way out for us." That is the very last entry in his diary. He dies 4 months later of tuberculosis, combination of tuberculosis, starvation, exhaustion, what we might term the ghetto disease. His sister, mother, and father will all die as well, although not in the ghetto. The father will, the sister and mother probably shipped to either Chelmno or Auschwitz. I want to show a brief video now. The editor of the text, the diary of David Sirakowiak, Alan Adelson, has made it into a movie, a documentary. It's pretty hard to get, but I wanted to show you a little clip so you could get an idea of what Adelson is thinking and how he contextualizes this piece as well. So I'll be quiet for a moment.
Hi everybody, I'm Roz Abrams. Welcome to Views. Tomorrow is Holocaust Remembrance Day. We decided to remember by looking at a diary. Not Anne Frank's diary, but the diary of David Sirakowiak, who at the age of 19 died in a Nazi concentration camp.
Friday, September 8th, 1939. German patrols are moving on Pietrkowska Street. Łódź is occupied.
These are scenes from the documentary Łódź Ghetto by Alan Adelson of the Jewish Heritage Project.
Outstanding among all the writings we gathered from the Łódź Ghetto was this young man's diary, the diary of David Sirakowiak.
Our local Germans treated their countrymen. Civilians, even boys and girls, are jumping into the passing military cars with the happy Heil Hitler.
David begins his diary when he's only 15 years old. He dies when he's 19.
May 4th, 1942. My legs have become weak. I can barely walk. We're so exhausted we don't have enough strength now to complain, let alone protest.
in more than 15 years with this literature, I've never read a single account which brings you more in touch with what ghetto life was, with those agonizing years before mass death.
Meanwhile, another student from our class died today from hunger exhaustion. Lung sickness is raging in the ghetto.
It sweeps people away as much as dysentery and typhus. And as for food, it's worse and worse everywhere. It's been a week since there were any potatoes. The Lodz Ghetto was an urban slave camp. It was a concentration camp where the Nazis held over 200,000 Jews and extracted their last strength from them, producing all kinds of goods for the German war effort and even consumer goods. David's family is exposed to the full brunt of torment and torture, which was ghetto life for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Jews before they were sent off to be destroyed.
People knew that they were going to their deaths. They fought the Germans and had to be forced onto the trucks.
September 5th, 1942, my most sacred, beloved, worn-out, blessed, cherished mother has
The doctors searched my mother for some ailment. He couldn't find any, but they designated her to be taken. A bloodthirsty Nazi beast.
Every bit of hardship which was imposed on David Hershkovitz brought out more wisdom from his young mind.
A commission of Germans came to our shop today. Our rulers, the masters of life and death. No sign of an early end to the war, judging from these people from the outer world.
People say, oh, the Holocaust, it's so depressing. But when you're really intimately exposed to these materials, as one is when you read this diary, you begin to feel charged with the same energy of life. And that's what this diary speaks of. It speaks of the best of the human spirit, even as the worst and most destructive of our human potential is coming to bear on the people who wrote these materials.
She kissed each one of us goodbye and left quickly. I couldn't muster the strength to look through the window. I was like a stone. My poor mother.
David lives on through his incredible diary, which has now been translated into 5 languages.
I think it's probably closer to 25 now languages. So up to this point, what I've tried to do is, I sort of struggled, actually. I struggled between trying to give you an in-depth account of the diary, and then I thought, well, if I tell you too much, you're not going to read it for yourselves. And it's more important for me to read it for you to read it for yourselves. And so I sort of hit and miss, missing major parts of it to leave these kind of cliffhangers, because I want you to go and read it for yourselves. But I thought how I might end is, especially for those of us who find ourselves in the classroom, or for those of us who are going to read it, what kind of questions should we be asking ourselves? I thought I might kind of very quickly go through. I don't know exactly how much time I have left, but I think we have at least 12 or 13 minutes. Yeah. I know you ran over, but I wasn't going to say anything. So I'm not going to talk about each one of these in depth, but these are some of the things that I think as teachers we could bring up with students. And one of the things that I really like about this memoir is you could get as sophisticated as you wanted. So, you know, in a college course devoted entirely to the Holocaust, I use this text. And of course, I get the students to go into a bit more detail. But you can also keep it at a much more superficial level. It doesn't have to get as detailed. At the sort of lighter level, you know, it might be interesting to ask students to consider the types of sources that they're probably most often used to. In particular, memoirs. You know, Primo Levi was mentioned, or Elie Wiesel. That is, these people who write these memoirs sometimes 3 or 4 decades after the experience. What do we get from a memoir that we don't get from a diary, and vice versa, right? What do each one of those serve? Are there strengths and are there weaknesses? This might be one way in which you might start a dialogue with students. I would disagree very much with what Alan Ellison just said in that little clip. Don't believe a word he said when he called the Łódź Ghetto a concentration camp. I don't know. I mean, he could debate me on this, but I'm not so certain I would agree with that. But what it clearly is, and what it was clearly called, and what the Nazis called it, was a ghetto. And what Sierkowiak also called it was a ghetto. So I think it would be interesting with students to say, what are the differences between a camp and a ghetto? That is, in purpose, in function, in the way it is set up, these sorts of things. And one of the things that I always stress to my students is the ghetto is, although it's often overshadowed in the broader sort of history of the Holocaust, it is crucially important for understanding the Holocaust experience as well as the trajectory of the Holocaust. So for 2 reasons. Number one, between 1 and 2 million people died in the ghettos. So of that 6 million figure, you know, 1 million, 1.5 million Jews died in the ghettos. That's all they knew. They didn't make it to those camps, those death camps, okay? So that's number one. And then number 2 would be the thinking about the context of the ghetto in this larger sort of history of the Holocaust. Why did they even exist? If they were just going to murder all of European Jewry, why didn't they just get at it right away, right? And of course, most scholars would argue that the decision for the murder of all of European Jewry hadn't been made in 1939. It hadn't been made in 1940. It was probably sometime in 1941 when the decision was made. And so what I often call the ghettos are temporary or stopgap measures. They're measures, they're kind of holding tanks for these people that they've got ideas about what they want to do, and they're not terribly nice ideas, but they haven't quite made that decision to murder all of European Jewry yet. So in trying to understand how the Holocaust evolved, the ghettos are a crucial piece of that puzzle. For a bit of a deeper kind of understanding of the Holocaust, that is looking at how the ghettos are administered, that is what I call the ghetto hierarchy, in particular the Jewish councils. What I would say is one of the most insidious aspects of Nazism is the way in which it subsumed the victims and made the victims part of their own destruction. That is, people wanting just to live another day, wanting to see that child that they sent off just a month or 2 before, make a decision to go on, to do certain things, and they might become part of, you know, this hierarchy, this camp hierarchy, which gives them better odds to live another day. We can't fault them for that. That is the system, the insidious system that is created by the Nazis. not just the hierarchy, Jewish police as well, the council members, the Älteste, and then of course what are the relationships between the Germans and the councils. That could be something that would be explored. The centrality of food, I think it's front and center in the diary of David Sirakowiak, and very closely linked to this is work. The Łódź ghetto lasts longer than any other ghetto in Europe. Its function as helping the German war cause. They are making both domestic and war goods in these German factories that are set up in Łódź. They're putting fur in helmets, they're making insulated boots for soldiers to fight in Russia, these various things. And since it generates revenue, this is probably why it's allowed to last until late 1944, before it is eventually liquidated. This is also the thinking of Chaim Rumkowski, the guy who runs the Älteste, or the elder of the Jews, of this Jewish council. He thought that he would save the most lives by making Łódź's Jews productive. He thought this, he said, they will never kill us all if we are productive. And it puts him in a very, very difficult decision, position to make these decisions when he realizes he was a bit short-sighted. That is, it's not all about economics for the Nazis. It's also about extermination and extermination policies by and through labor. So this is something that I think is interesting. Much of the diary is him, his sister, his mom, and his dad sort of shuffling through, trying to find jobs. Because if you had a job in the Łódź ghetto, you got an extra ration while you were at work. You got what he usually refers to as water, but he means soup. But it's so thin, there might be some bits of an old turnip or something kind of in the bottom somewhere. But it's mostly what we would think of as broth. But that was vital. He, in many instances, says unemployment equals death. You have to be working in the Łódź ghetto. You have to have that extra ration, because Bibov set ration limits at 700 to 900 calories a day on paper. 700 to 900. I don't think they reach that. I don't know if anybody knows what you should be eating to have a healthy diet. Triple that, right? Double to triple that, depending on what you do, what kind of activities you do, or male or female. So that is the system that Bibov creates, is one of slow starvation. And this is kind of a red thread that goes throughout the diary. And this is, I have to tell you, this is, I mean, none of these things are easy reading, but this aspect of it is really, really difficult. Because one of the things that this leads to, and one of the most disheartening parts of this, another one of those very insidious aspects of the system that the Nazis create, is we see this tear the Sirakowiak family apart. And it's gut-wrenching to read it. In particular because the father starts taking more of the rations than he's supposed to have. He starts literally stealing from his wife, stealing from his children, and it is hard to read. And these are one of the things that exacerbates the tensions between David and his father. You can kind of tell from that quote. You can tell from the quote in the film. He was very, very close to his mother, and you can see by the end of it, he is, in no uncertain terms, sees his father partly responsible for her health condition, which eventually will get her shipped off, probably to Auschwitz. This also brings the issue of coping and survival strategies. This is one of the common things that is talked about in lots of different diaries and memoirs. How do they go about doing these things? How do you put up with the monumental weight of what you are witnessing? How do they survive? I like the idea of coping strategies as well, and it's very clear with David Sirakowiak. His books. He talks about how, he's tired, he's starving, his feet are swelling, he's coughing because he has tuberculosis, all this stuff, but he has his books. He can study Hebrew, he can study English, he can read, Aristotle, he can do these things. And for him, that's something that keeps him motivated. That's something that kind of drives him. It also allows us to, and I have this in quotes here, one of the very specious arguments that is made, or that many students have when they study the Holocaust is, why didn't the Jews realize this was coming, right? Why didn't they read the writing on the wall and know that it was time to hightail it out of Poland or Germany or Czechoslovakia or wherever it is? And I think the diary of Sierkowiak is one of those kind of damning, irrefutable statements against that. Because you see, even as bright as he is, as perceptive as he is, he doesn't know what's going on all of the time. In one very heartbreaking part, he's talking about how people are going to be sent off to a labor camp. We know now that that group of 20,000 individuals were sent to Chelmno, to the death camp at Chelmno. Other times, a little bit later in the story, he knows the name Chelmno. He uses the term gassing. And so you can see that because of the diary, because of him doing this day by day or hour by hour, we kind of get a sense of what did people actually know on the ground. And it flies very much in the face of this kind of, why didn't they know what was going to happen to them? Closely connected to that would be this issue of resistance as well. One of the questions, or one of the statements that's often made, even by well-known prominent Holocaust historians, is Jews went to the gas chambers like sheep to the slaughter. This is an argument that is sometimes made. And the question is, why in a place like Łódź with 230 to 250,000 people, didn't they rise up? Why wasn't there some sort of a revolt, something like would have happened in Warsaw? And of course the answer is because they very much believed that being useful and helping the Germans win the war, or at least in the war effort, was going to be their saving grace. To rise up would be counterintuitive, and we get that sense from the diary. The other thing that I think is really interesting, one of the things I always push my students to look at, is to pay very careful attention to the language that the Nazis use when they are talking about what they're doing. Very famously, they hide a bunch of this stuff behind euphemisms. And so on my, might be my very last slide, I think, one of the euphemisms is resettlement. Sierkowiak uses the term all of the time. This document that I have up here is a document created by, it's really small down here, but it's Chaim Rumkowski's name, the elder of the Jews of Litzmannstadt, using the German of Łódź. And it says that, and I'll just paraphrase, I won't read it word for word, but it says the Jews from Luxembourg, from Vienna, from Prague, from Western Europe, those that had been recently settled in the Łódź ghetto, they are now going to be resettled. And it tells you the date that they're going to be resettled on, and it tells them that they can only pack up to 12.5 kilograms of stuff to bring with them. So their suitcase has to be under a certain weight limit. Any information they want to know, they can call on the office, that is, walk to the office. Of course, what does resettlement mean? They might not have known this in late 1941 or early 1942, but we know that this massive group, and one of the things that Sierkowiak has trouble sort of trying to figure out is, we've got so many Jews here already, we're overcrowded, typhus and tuberculosis is everywhere. Why are they bringing in more people? Why are these Jews coming in? They're in good physical condition. They seem to have stuff with them. Why are they coming in here? It's very clear that they haven't put two and two together yet, right? And these are the ones who will be sent to Auschwitz and Chelmno. They'll be broken off into a couple of groups. And so this resettlement, this word that he uses, and he says, you know, the workers are going to be resettled. They're going to go to another labor camp or something like that. they co-opt the language, not exactly knowing what it means. I think I will end there and save time for questions.
A couple of questions. Like, A, where do you get the book?
The library. The library has both
Barb will help you get the book. She's
the
better
library
at
has
this.
both the book and the film. So the Akron Summit County Public Library.
Yeah, go ahead.
What grade? I teach 7th grade, and currently I teach 9th for my novel. Would this be appropriate for 7th grade?
I think it's a. So this is a personal decision, I think, for you. I never tell people what they should teach or what level. 7th grade might be a little dicey, might be pushing it. You should read it for yourself. I think 9th grade is perfectly fine for. But I'm maybe a bit more conservative when it comes to this kind of stuff. I personally...
I know night is hard for 7th grade.
Yeah, and I think this is probably a little harder to read parts of it. It's not just that, but I want to use the word sophisticated. It might be a little bit more sophisticated too. And so I think high school certainly. Junior high it is, and I thought about this question, I would want you to read it yourself and kind of make the decision. Are there things that you're comfortable talking about with the students or that you're very uncomfortable, you know? And, you know, for me, you know, 4th graders going through a Holocaust museum, that's something that I would never do, even 6th graders. But again, I'm kind of conservative when it comes to that sort of thing. Yeah, what else? Other questions? Did I stun you? Was it too much information? Or it probably just paled in comparison to Esther?
No.
No. What language was it originally?
It is in Polish, and that's actually a good point. There is more of it than we have translated into English. I don't read Polish, so I don't know what is different about it, but the gist of it, the main corpus of it is here, and I don't think it's anything that would sort of alter the way you would think about the whole thing. 2 of the notebooks are in Poland, and 3 of the notebooks are at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., the originals.
Part of our discussion we co-teach was to find another subject other than Anne Frank. We teach 8th grade.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have a suggestion for someone else to bring into the picture other than...
Barb has, if you have one, but Barb is also going to address that later. Go ahead. Okay, sorry.
It would be more appropriate for 7th, 8th grade.
So are you saying you don't like Anne Frank, or
We
you're
do.
tired of it, or?
Not that we're tired of her, we want them to get a broader perspective than just, that's the, like you said, that's
So
what
Anne Frank
comes to
and
everyone's mind.
Hershkovitz are the 2 that are compared the most, since they're close in age and their experiences are kind of similar. I don't know of another child survivor that I would say is a standalone thing.
What about Peter Lentz?
Peter Lentz might be one that I would say is probably
Is he
the closest.
artist that they found artwork of his? Is that?
He was an artist and a writer.
Yeah, I was going to say I know his literature,
Right.
not his art, but he very well could have been an
His
artist.
diary is before he sent to Theresienstadt. Once he gets to Theresienstadt, he becomes sort of the driving force behind a secret magazine. But he writes, again, that sort of the news tightening before he's reported to Theresienstadt, and I think he's very accessible. So
Yeah,
that
I
might be
would
a
say that as
possibility.
well. Yeah. So certainly for 7. One last one.
One of the books that you might like is The Devil's Arithmetic.
Yeah.
And even though it is not a true story, it does bring the students at that level, the 7th, 8th grade level, to the correct understanding of the
Yeah,
numbers.
fiction has a way of doing that, right? That sometimes
Right.
nonfiction
So,
you can struggle with.
You can bring in fiction, and I will tell you, it mirrors my mother's experience in the Holocaust. So when you are reading that, there is a lot of truth to the angle of the experience of many of the Holocaust victims.
Yeah, I would second that, but I would be very, very cautious in making sure that there's a solid and thorough introduction on why you would be reading fiction in the context of the Holocaust, right? That is to make sure it's clear. And
It's easier for your students at 7th and 8th grade to digest a little bit of fiction and understanding the
I'm going to be awful, and I apologize because I started this. Please don't.
that's okay.
The reason Mark is here is that I am a docent at the Moles Museum in Cleveland, and I had the privilege, I go back every summer to hear who the presenter is about the Holocaust. And I had the privilege to study with him twice, and I knew we had to bring him to Akron.
Thank you.
Eddie Wiesel says, when you listen to a witness, you become a witness. And Irene Adler is the woman who has just raised her hand, and she is a fabulous educator in her own right, though retired, still involved, as they say. Her mother, Rose Calvin Schwartz, just died in September after a long and difficult life in Europe, but a wonderful life here. Both of her parents are survivors, and the fund that was established by their children is in the honor and respect of their name. Just a moment on Rose. She lost her parents and 5 siblings in the Holocaust. She was from Cluj, Romania. But their memories gave her strength and courage and the will to survive 5 concentration camps and 2 death marches. If you knew Rosie, you could understand the courage. After the camps were liberated, she met her husband, Lawrence Larry, in Salzburg, Austria, and through the Jewish Federation, they were able to immigrate to the United States and then ultimately to Akron. They made a home, they had children, they lighted our lives. She shared her story for almost 50 years. With the exception of Abraham Pfeffer, who I mentioned before, I know no one who started speaking as early as she did. She was the first and longest lasting survivor to tell us all. And Irene continues to tell the story. So tonight we have the privilege of hearing from 2 other stories. Ingrid Hausen Kennedy is a child survivor herself, so she is an actual eyewitness. And as she told me before, you're young and you don't remember everything, but to hear the words of somebody who was any place you want to know about is very precious. So she'll tell some of her story, the story of her family, and I'm thrilled to say she has a daughter and 2 granddaughters here. There's a personal cheering section, and particularly her daughter because she's also a teacher. And then we're going to hear from Uri Hershkovitz, who is a grandson of Holocaust survivors, so-called 3rd generation. He's from Hod HaSharon in Israel, and he is one of the 2 Israeli shlichim that are here to share Israeli culture. And he'll tell you why it's so important to him to do that. I gave you a limited bio on both of them. They're in your packet. And if the video is at all usable, we'll get you a link. So Ingrid, if you will come, and I have to tell you that she usually tells this to children. So I told her to pretend that she's giving us a child. It's interesting because from her you're going to hear what does somebody tell a student.
Don't think. I can shout. Am I loud enough?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Anyway, I want to thank Esther for inviting me. We know each other since a while. Thank you for this invitation, and hello everybody. My name is Ingrid Kennedy. I was born Ingeborg Hausen. My husband is Joseph. We have 3 daughters, 5 granddaughters, and 3 great-grandchildren. The name Kennedy, it's almost a joke because the real name was Kaufman, and it was changed during the war for you know what purposes. Anyway, I'm a survivor. I'm old enough. I was there during the war, the whole time in Europe. And many, many sad things happened, of course. But I usually don't like to dwell on sad things. My character is always looking at the positive things. And I try. But some things still remain sad. Anyway, my parents were Jenny and Edward Hausen. They lived in Vienna. My father had an engineering degree and worked for a big company doing radios, loudspeakers, all kinds of things that were new in those days. He worked there in 1933. My mother had an accounting degree, so she worked for the same company. And that's where they met. They fell in love, they got married in 1934, and in 1936 I appeared. After my mother had her usual, I don't know how many weeks that was, maternity leave, she went back to work, and we had a lovely apartment in Vienna. We had a maid and we had a nanny for me. So life went on, and life was pretty okay in those days. Lots of theaters, lots of music, Vienna was a lovely city. Until 1939, when the war started. Hitler had annexed Austria, and things started to go sour. There were raids. My parents were forced to wear the yellow star, and they deported many people already, friends of theirs, people left and right were taking, and I think the reason my father was allowed to work a little longer in this company, the company was making things that were important to the war. So he was needed for a while, but that didn't last too long. In 1940, January of 1940, my father got a phone call in the middle of the afternoon from a friend, a good friend of his who was not Jewish and had a very high job in the Bureau of Investigation of Austria, which is the equivalent to our FBI, and told him in such words, Eddie, you and your brother-in-law next door have to disappear before tomorrow morning, and that's a must. I cannot talk anymore, and he hung up. So my father said to my mother, my aunt, my uncle, well, if he said so, we have to disappear because he must know something. So the two men packed little suitcases, went to the midnight train to Italy, where my father had a sister-in-law. His older brother married an Italian lady. The next morning, around 6 or 6:30 in the morning, the Gestapo knocked at the door looking for the men to transport them, of course, to concentration camps. My mother and my aunt said, sorry, the men didn't come home after work yesterday, we don't know where they are. For the time being, they only took men. Children and women came a little later. On the train, my uncle and my father met another Jewish man who told them when they get to Paris, there is a section, a Jewish section of the city, and that's where they should go when they arrive there, and maybe they will find help, jobs, who knows. On the way to Paris, of course, they stopped in Italy first. And my aunt was there with her 2 children. My uncle had left 6 months before. He was working for a big company, a shoe company called Bata, and he was sent to Amsterdam to head an office there. So in Amsterdam, he was caught by the Germans. was sent to a camp, but it was a working camp at first. And he and other prisoners there were laying mines in the beaches all day long. Some of them died, some exploded, but anyway, he was lucky he survived for a while. My uncle told us later that one of the guards, the German guards in that camp, started to be a little bit nice to him. Once in a while, he brought him a little extra food even. So he was a little scared, but he just stayed on his guards. And one day, that guard came to him and told him, "Tomorrow night, I want you to meet me after dark behind the kitchen, and I will tell you what we will do." So my uncle met him there, and the guard told him, "I have to tell you my secret. I am a homosexual, and it's kept under a big secret, because if the Germans, the Nazis ever find out, I will wind up in a concentration camp also. And I found out that in about 3 days from now, you will be sent to a concentration camp on the next train. And I think that a good-looking man like you should not be killed, and therefore I want to help you escape." Now that's one of the stories that is a happy story instead of a sad one. So he did help my uncle. My uncle escaped. Going back to the boys, my father and my other uncle, they arrived in Paris, and they went to the Jewish district as told. My uncle spoke some Yiddish. My father did not. And they spoke 10 words of French. So they went to the Jewish district, and they did find some people. I guess they felt sorry for them, told them their story, and they did give them part-time jobs. They were delivering food to kosher stores. So at least they earned something. They did a little something. They wrote to my mother and my aunt, "You should sell whatever you can, your jewelry, whatever household things you can sell, and follow us as soon as possible." And that's what they did. In March of 1940, my mother, my aunt's son, who was 19 years old, and me, we departed. We went on a train to Germany. We had some papers, no passports of course, just some papers to prove that we are Austrian citizens. And we landed in Stuttgart. From Stuttgart, we hitchhiked, we walked, whatever we could, until we finally arrived, after a few days, on the border of France. And it was the side of France called Alsace. We arrived there, and at the border, of course, we were caught. And these guards took us to a police station nearby, and my cousin explained who we were. We are Austrian Jews, and we are trying to escape the Nazis. And our husbands are already in France, and we want to follow them. So they took our papers, and they took us to a small inn nearby, where people were having their dinner. And among these people was a man who was the editor of the local little newspaper. They were really nice to us. They gave us some supper, and they put us up in a room, all of us in one room, but that was fine. And the next morning, they gave us a breakfast, and my cousin read the paper of the day. It said, "A bunch of Jews crossed the border illegally last night. They had 2 women, a child, and a young man. They are Jews, but they look like us." So that's how we left that little village. They put us on a train, and we arrived in Paris. My father and my uncle had written to us about a meeting point in a Jewish section of a town in a kosher restaurant. So that's where we met. From there, they took us to a small city, a suburb of Paris called Meaux. In Meaux, they rented a small house, enough for the 6 of us, with a nice big garden, fruit trees, and a little brook passing through the garden. After we stayed there for a while, my parents found me one morning throwing stones in the little brook and asked me, "What are you doing?" I said, "I am throwing the bad war in the water."
How old were you then?
I was born in 36.
So,
I was 5 years old. But anyway, so after a little while, the jobs were kind of meager, but we had some bread and we had some food, not too much, but whatever we could. And we said, my parents said, we have to find an idea to make a little more money. What can we do? My mother and my aunt said, well, we have big garden with a lot of fruit trees. We know how to make jams. So let's try to make jams. It would not be too expensive. Let's buy some jars, cheap jars, buy a little sugar, and pots, 2 big pots, and we can make jams. So they made about a dozen assorted jams from all the fruit they could gather. And my father and my uncle took those pots to the stores where they were working and offered them for sale. Their bosses said, well, we'll buy them from you. They probably felt sorry for them because they were poor immigrants. And 2 weeks later, the bosses told them, can you bring more jams? We sold them to our clients and they loved them. So how much can you make? So this is how we started a little business in France, near Paris. Then they had some other ideas. They bought figs, dried figs, and roasted them on an open fire and ground them and added a little bit of chicory to it and packaged it and called it ersatz coffee. During the war, you could not get coffee. So that sold very well too. So that was added to the business. And this went on for a little while. They lived as well as they could there. But the Germans, the Nazis, followed us in France, of course. The bombing started all over. Every time alarms came up, we had to have refuge in the basement, drag pillows, drag blankets, and we were very scared. To this day, I remember the noise, bzzz, boom, bzzz, boom, constant. Every other week, every 10 days it happened, and we always ran to the basement and were scared to death. But at least we survived. One morning, we got up after the bombing, went upstairs, and the house next to us was in ruins. Didn't exist anymore. Luckily, our neighbors survived in the basement, but the house was gone. In that place, I made some friends. 2 little girls next door, around my age, and I learned French very fast. When you're young, you learn the language pretty fast. So I became the translator for my parents and my aunt and uncle. And the 2 houses on the other side, I made a friend too, a little girl. And I was invited there very often. Her parents were tall, very good-looking people, very friendly. Her father spoke German and French perfectly without any accent in either language. So my parents were a little scared. Who knows? He's a German, maybe he's going to spill the beans and tell the Nazis that we are Jews. And so they told me, you know, don't say anything. But I was a kid, 5 years old. He asked me the name of my grandparents, the name of my family, the name of my uncles and aunts. And I told him. And my parents told me, you better not go there anymore. Anyway, I'll tell you about him later. There were more bombings, and my parents started to speak to Jewish organizations. There were quite a few in France who were trying to help refugees do what they can for them. So they said, my father, uncle, and cousin are better off enlisting in the French army, otherwise they will be deported pretty soon. So they did that, and the women and the child were put in a small town south of Paris called Brive. There, my mother and my aunt were in a vineyard. And they gave us a very small apartment, one room, a little bathroom. Bathroom means a bathtub, a john, and a bidet. Toilet was in the hallway. And anyway, it was okay for us. And during the day, my mother and my aunt were in the vineyard with the grapes, picking grapes and helping there. I was sent to a school, a Catholic school run by nuns. We were about 12 little Jewish girls there. The nuns told us, we give you new names, and that's what you have to remember. My name was Marie-Louise. My family name was Hausen, so they told me from now on the spelling will be different and it will be called Hausen. So I was Marie-Louise Hausen. They also told us, never, never tell your real name to anybody. Never tell anybody that you understand German, because we were all little Austrian or German girls. Everybody spoke German. Because soldiers are going to come once in a while, and you better keep quiet. Soldiers did come. And we never said anything, we just let them talk. The nuns were good. They gave us 2 meals, breakfast and lunch. And they told us, you have to eat everything in your plate, because to waste food is a sin, especially during the war. That was not too much of a problem, because the portions they gave us were not very big. And so that's how we survived for a while. In the evening, usually after a meager dinner, my mother, my aunt, and I went downstairs, very close to our apartment, was a small cafe, and many Jewish ladies gathered there, talked a lot, lamented about we don't know where the husbands are. Some of them were dead already, some they had no idea. And they read a newspaper called the Vorwärts. That was a Jewish newspaper, but this one was in German language. That was the Bible for them. Everything they read there and hoped to find out if anybody heard about the husbands, where they were, what happened to them, we had no idea. But one day, it went on for a long time. One day was in 1941, no, 1942, sorry. I think I have the dates right. My mother was reading that paper, and she started to scream, scared me. She was half laughing and half crying, and just screaming, and I kept saying, Mama, Mama, what's going on? She read, Edward Hausen is trying to find out if his wife and child are still alive, and if they are, please call this number in Paris. So my father just got discharged from the army. The last 6 months in the army, they were sent to Morocco, to the Foreign Legion, because they were Austrians. But then they were finally discharged. So that's how we got together with my father and my uncle again. Now, I want to tell you briefly what happens to other members of our family. I said before that I like more happy things and not too many sad things, but there were sad ones, of course. On the side of my father, for instance, at the end of the war, there were 3 people left. My father, his older brother, who was in Amsterdam and was saved, and 1 lady cousin. Everybody else, his parents, his cousins, his aunts, uncles, everybody died in concentration camps. My mother's side, we were a little bit luckier. My grandparents, my mother's parents, also made it over to France through another route. They were gathered with a bunch of elderly people, elderly Jews in the north of France, also a small town, in a farm. But unfortunately, after 6 or 7 months there, somebody squealed, or we don't know how it happened. The Nazis found out. And they gathered all these elderly people in the square, the big square of the city. They were supposed to wait there for the train to be transported to Germany. My grandmother told me later, during this wait there in the square, suddenly a jeep appeared, a big jeep, with a driver and 2 men in German uniform. One of them stood up, a tall, very good-looking man, and called their name, Mr. and Mrs. Gross. He told them to come to the jeep, so they came shaking, and he told them to get into the jeep, and they drove away to a safe place. He put my grandparents in a safe place. That was the man, the neighbor we had with his little girl, my friend, who my parents were so afraid of, and he actually saved my grandparents. We found out after the war from his wife that he was born in Alsace and raised with the 2 languages, so he was perfect in both, just like me, French and German. And he was a counter-spy for the Allies, for our side. And eventually the Germans found out, and they killed him. So that was the story on that one. Then came the people who survived on my mother's side. Luckily, some did. My mother's younger sister, unfortunately, and her husband both died in a concentration camp. When they were caught, she was expecting their first child. Another sister of my mother, her husband was taken in Vienna and sent to a concentration camp and died there. My aunt and her daughter escaped and ran also to the border of France, and they were saved by the underground called the Maquis in France. That's how they were saved. My uncle, my mother had only 1 brother, his wife was a high school sweetheart of his. He just finished law school when the war broke out. And they decided they're not waiting, it's too dangerous. They went on a boat with a lot of other younger people to what is now Israel, but it was then Palestine, and that's how they survived there. And then we survived that way. Now, whoops. My mother's older sister was a seamstress in Vienna. Her husband was a Greek and Latin professor. They had 1 son. They managed to find Highest was an organization in France to help Jews, and their son found a place in New York, in America, in a Jewish family, and they were able to ship him there. They also escaped to France, and they were hidden in a convent. Nuns took care of them. My aunt sewed all kinds of things for them and helped in the kitchen. My uncle did all kinds of chores he was not used to, but whatever he could, he did. One morning, my aunt woke up with a horrible pain in her abdomen. She told the nuns, and the nuns called a doctor. A doctor came and told them, well, we have to take this woman to the hospital because it's her appendix and she needs surgery. The nuns said, no, no, no. We cannot take her to a hospital because they will find out who she is, and guess what? She will be put on a train to Germany. So they brought in a surgeon, a nurse, and they had the surgery in the convent with some nuns helping out. So when I said that I like to dwell on good things, all these were very good things. And all these people helped us. They all had a wonderful heart. They knew we were Jewish. They didn't care. They wanted to help us. And I thought it's very important not to forget the Holocaust. Absolutely. Too much happened to us. Too many of us died horribly. But we should also never forget the people who helped us. There were many of them in France, in Holland, even in Germany. And my father decided to send the name of the man who saved his life in the first place, his friend, take his name, send it to Israel, to the Yad Vashem, because that should also never be forgotten. Now, after my father came back from the army and we settled in Morocco, he made some connections in the food industry. He had made some friends there, wholesalers, French people and Arabs. The Moroccan Arabs were very nice at the time. They were really very friendly and liked the foreigners. So in 1943, my father decided to start a business with the same line they had. He did packaged spices, all kinds of spices, and eventually had clients in Morocco too, sold to them and some in France. After the war, we went back to Vienna, and we went to find the man who saved my father, an old friend of his from school. We found him, his wife and his kids, but he was the same age as my father, and he looked at least 25 years older. He was a wreck, absolutely horrible looking and sick. One eye was gone. All his nails were pulled out. The Nazis caught him. He saved not only my father, many other Jewish friends of his. The Nazis caught him and just martyrized him. They wanted him to admit that he was a traitor to his country and was trying to save Jews. He said, I am an Austrian, I love my country, I will never admit that I am a traitor because I don't believe in the Nazi regime and you can do to me what you want. His wife said he would have been better off if they killed him because what he did to him was horrible, but he never admitted that. So that's kind of our story. Thank you. Too many died, but quite a few survived, so we are very thankful. And we are around.
Yes.
And some of our wonderful families here with the 10
Right.
What we're going to do is we're going to let Uri talk a little bit, and then we'll have a few questions for both of them. And we'll bring some food in here because you're probably all ready to fall over. So, Uri, if you come now, and then we'll do the questions after.
Okay. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you all for being here. I can't express how much this means to me. I'll try to make this short because I know you've heard so much and it's so hard to digest. And it's late and we're all hungry. That's great. So I'm a grandson to 2 Holocaust survivors. But just before I start on that, I want to say that my name is Uri, and my wife Gili here with me. We're the new Israeli Shlichim for Akron and Canton. We'll be here for the next year or 2. And on your tables we have pamphlets of all the events that we're doing in the next 2 months, and we'd be very happy if you join us. And if you just want to talk and hear more of my story, our story, or want to talk about Israel, about the Holocaust, or anything that we can do to help promote Jewish and Israel education in your schools, in your high schools, wherever we can, then we'll be very happy to. And our emails are there, and our phone numbers are there. So please contact us. We'll be more than happy to. I'm going to talk today about 2 things, and I'll try to make it short because, as I said, I want to talk about the story of my grandparents because I think it is so important to tell their story, and I think, for me at least, it is some form of catharsis. And the second thing I want to talk about is being a 3rd generation to a Holocaust survivor. So please bear with me if I'm short and I don't give you all the details just because there's so much to say. My grandparents are Dov and Uri Hershkovitz. They're both from Czechoslovakia, and they have both since passed away. My grandfather passed away over 20 years ago when I was very young, and my grandmother passed away about a year ago, just before Gili and I got wed. And they were a bit older than most of the stories we hear about the Holocaust. Dov was 26 when World War II started, and Rachel was 17. They were both born in Czechoslovakia. Rachel was from Prague originally, and Dov was from a very, very small village in the Carpathy Mountains. He came from a religious family. They had 8 children, and he started studying at a yeshiva at the age of 3, and then continued studying a very known yeshiva called the Galante Yeshiva in Slovakia. And he was also a very, very enthusiastic Zionist, and he was expelled from his yeshiva because of his Zionist activities. But that didn't stop him from continuing doing that. And he was part of a youth movement called Chelet Lavan, which means teal and white, which are also the colors of your tallis or the Israeli flag. And he was instrumental in helping the young Jews try and get to Israel. And I say try and get to Israel because sadly, in the years that we're talking about, it was very hard to get to Israel, and people weren't very cooperative. Sometimes it was impossible, sometimes they were turned back. And there are very tragic tales of Europeans, mostly British soldiers, sinking boats with Jews trying to get to Israel on them, and many perished. And from all his friends and guides that worked with him, very few survived to tell their story from the Holocaust. In the spring of 1942 is when we start hearing more about how the Holocaust affected him specifically. He was working at the time with around 800 homeless and displaced youth. They all moved to try to get away from the horrors of the war, and were working in a communal farm together in a socialist group, trying to get them ready to become pioneers in the land of Israel. And they were all caught and moved to the ghetto Theresienstadt, where he continued to organize youth activities with the remnants of the youth movement and help organize social work and help his former pupils. Now, Ghetto Theresienstadt is a very special ghetto in that it was a ghetto that was meant to be shown to the world as how Germany was treating Jews and treating all the people that were displaced. And they kept bringing people there, very important people, and the Red Cross to show them how they have cultural events and they show on plays and everyone is being treated well. But the truth was that behind the scene they were treated very poorly. And but because of the way the ghetto was built, he was able to continue working as part of the youth movement and helping his students, his pupils. And that's where he met his wife, Rachel, who was actually a former pupil of his, and back when they were still in Prague. She was living in Prague at the time, and she was a teenager when everything happened and when Germany occupied Czechoslovakia. And when they occupied it, then you could see how slowly, the treatment to Jews became worse and worse. They were separated, they were branded, they were unable to enter stores. Jews and dogs were not allowed to enter here. They were moved out of camps and eventually to extermination camps. She and her entire family were moved to different ghettos, and she was 17 when she saw her family for the last time, because no one survived. She had 2 parents, 2 younger sisters, and a brother, and none of them she ever saw again. So she was moved to Theresienstadt ghetto as well, and they got married in the ghetto. It's actually a funny story, one of the few, because they met at the ghetto, and he loved her more than she loved him, and he proposed, and she was willing to marry him as long as her high school sweetheart did not find her after the war. Which she didn't. And they have a ketubah, a Jewish marriage contract or certificate that was handwritten by a rabbi in the ghetto and survived to this day. And it's one of the very, very few that actually survived. And it's a very, very unique item that means so much to us and to so many people. And one of those small moments where we had positive karma in our lives. My grandmother died at the age of 95. And she was very ill in her last years. And we have very many documents of her time there and photos, which sadly I couldn't bring with me because they're all packed away and organized in Israel. And when she passed away, we were going through all the items and we could not find the ketubah. Whatever we did, we could not find it. We could find a photocopy of it, but it's not the same thing as having the original document. And it was so important to us to find it, and we tore the whole house down. We could not find it. And we decided at some point, after hours and hours of trying to find it, we could not locate it, that we donate all her physical belongings that people could use to charity to people who need them, her bed and her drawers and everything. And one of the drawers went to a distant friend of mine who was a college student at the time, just moving for the first time into an apartment of his own. And when we were breaking it down so we could give it to him, we found it lodged behind one of the drawers. And that was an amazing moment for us, and we still have it to this day. I think it's been donated since to Yad Vashem, so if you ever go there, you can find the original handwritten ketubah from that time. So they got married, and they are a part of a group that smuggled a tree on Tu B'Shvat, which is the Jewish Arbor Day, into Theresienstadt ghetto, and planted it right there in the middle, and consecrated it with the phrase, Ki yemei ha'etz yemei ami, which means, for the days of a tree are the days of my people, which is an amazing sentence to show the strength and the longevity of Jews all around the world. And that sentence is still written on my grandfather's tombstone today. But at around October 1944, my grandfather was sent to Auschwitz, along with most of the members of the Zionist youth who were still in Theresienstadt at that time. They were met by Joseph Mengele, also known as the Angel of Death, the man who met you at the cart and decided if you are going to live or die or be experimented on in horrendous ways and inhumane ways. And he sent most of the women, elderly, children straight to the gas chambers, and my grandfather was transported to Birkenau to work in very harsh conditions where he met his younger brother, Yaakov, who is the only member of his family to survive to this day. He would work there for around 2 months, and many of his pupils died around him while they were working there from food poisoning, from starvation, from fatigue. And he did everything he could to help them survive. He would smuggle food for them, and he'd take shifts for them. And he was caught at some point, and he was marked for execution because of it. And about a few hours before he was supposed to be executed, there was an Allied bombing. And in the confusion, he was able to switch his uniform with a uniform of someone who has already passed away, and that's what saved him. He was moved to Dachau later, and he was infected by typhus and almost died, but the very few people that he still knew that and cared about him managed to smuggle a Jewish doctor into the camp and help him get over it, only to be sent to the death march as last resort of the Nazis to get as many of them killed as they can. But he survived that as well, and went back to Prague to find Rachel, who was still in Theresienstadt at that time, where she stayed and decided to keep a low profile and help educate and help the sick and the ill, even though she has no prior knowledge or education in the field. But she helped many people at that time. And at the end of 1945, they received a license to make Aliyah to the land of Israel, and they boarded the ship Transylvania. And they got to the kibbutz Kvar Am, which is in southern Israel near Ashkelon. My grandfather joined the Palmach, which is the Israeli defense and resistance movement before the founding of the land of Israel, to defend the upcoming Jewish homeland. They later moved to Moshav Geha, and then to Ashkelon. So they went through the whole shebang of going through the kibbutz and working a communal movement, and then moving to a city and having like their own sheep and cows. But they weren't very rich, or rich at all. And actually, when they got to Varam, the kibbutz was so poor that because they were Holocaust survivors and very thin, they got an extra, like, thin slice of butter a week, because that's what they could afford to give Holocaust survivors more than everyone else. And they left the kibbutz because the kibbutz made a decision at some point that they have to grow pigs to feed people, because they're easy to grow and they make a lot of food for people. And as a religious man, he understood the decision of the kibbutz, but he would not do it for his family. And that's how they moved. My grandfather served in the military, the Israel military, for a very long time and helped defend the country. But he was also a man of education. He was the person in charge of education in Ashkelon, which is the city they moved to after a point. He worked a lot with youth. He traveled back to Europe to the places where he suffered to help teach and educate teenagers and pupils who would come and hear his story. He did that for many, many years, just up until before he passed away. And my grandmother worked with all the soldiers and helped them rest and recuperate from all the wars and all the fighting they had been going through. And up until the year she passed away, we meet every year on Yom HaShoah and see the federal ceremony in Israel, in the Kotel. And for her, it was some sort of compensation, some sort of personal victory to have her family around her to watch that in the land of Israel. They had 3 children, Mordechai, Israel, which is my father, and Hagar. They have 6 grandchildren and currently 5 great-grandchildren. That's their story. May their memory be blessed, and may their story inspire others. But before I finish, I want to talk for just a few minutes on how it is to be a 3rd generation of a Holocaust survivor. So, just a few more minutes. So, I can't express how important it is for me to continue telling this story. Growing up, I kept hearing it over and over from my grandmother, because I was too young to remember my grandfather very well. But it might seem childish, but it's such a burden to bear, even 2 generations afterwards. I'd go to my grandmother and tell her, hey, I did really well in this test, or I got accepted to this university, or I got married, and somehow it always related back to the Shoah. Like, you would tell her anything, and she would be, that is amazing, I'm so happy for you, because we did not have food when we were in the ghetto. And that just puts so many things in your life into perspective. It's hard to ever say something that is meaningful in that context. And for them, coming to the land of Israel, then for a Holocaust survivor who just came to Israel in the early years of the country, it was something that people did not talk about. They felt ashamed of it. They felt that people who were already living there saw them as people who did not rise and fight up for themselves, as we've talked about before. And it took many years until people started telling their stories. But inside their house, you'd see a split of people who would either not tell anything to their kids or not stop talking about it. And with my family's case, they would not stop talking about it because they saw it as their destiny to continue passing the story onwards. So even though my father tried to help me get through it and not burden me with the stories, I kept hearing it from my grandparents. And for me personally, it's an obligation to continue telling the story and be part of it, and show people that this is something that is so important, how you can be in the harshest of situations such an amazing person or such a horrible person. And it's a personal choice that people make and go on to do amazing things and have these great stories to share with people. And that is why I keep telling it. And I am doing education, and I'm involved in all these amazing things. And for me, at least, it's their legacy. So thank you so much.
Their stories are in shorter versions are in your packets. We will, if this photo thing worked, Claire, we will put on the city website. This is why we wanted everybody's email address. We will send you links to go to things, okay? Let's just take a couple of minutes. If anybody has any questions that we'd like to add. And the article, by the way, that I told you that's on the left is an article that discusses the third generation responsibilities as it plays in Israel. And I thought it would fit with what Uri had to say. Anyone have anything in particular? Or are you so overwhelmed that you need it? I can't thank everybody enough. All of you for being here. You don't know what it means to me as a Jew, as an educator, as an American, as a human being, that you're here. Because I'm old enough to tell you, I'm counting on you. As Eddie Wiesel says, if you hear a witness, you become a witness. That's your charge.